So my name is Salton Eisen, and I will be telling you about two remarkable women who saved Jewish children during the Holocaust. One of them was named Irena Sendler, a young Catholic social worker, and the other, pictured here, is my mother, Ruth Salton, whose real name and story I didn't know. I had thought that my mother's original last name was Nickelsburg, as we see here on the card, and that she was from Poland. But in this immigration document, it says that my mother's name was Ruth Wolfberg and that she was a dressmaker from Berlin who was accompanied by an Aunt Nickelsburg on the way to America. Along with this, here is a photograph from the Holocaust Museum. This is one of 16 photographs that my mother gave to the museum that I had never seen before. Here, my mother on the far left is with a group of children after the Holocaust. I wondered, who were these children? And after all, who was my mother? My mother had always been more reluctant to speak publicly about the Holocaust. But after my father passed away in 2016, I went through his records on the home computer and found some notes for a talk that my mother was given. Here in her notes, she said, "Some Jewish parents on the way to the extermination had the strength and luck to leave their little children with brave Christians. Those who saved these children were courageous and committed, and their very existence was like a light in the darkness that gave us hope." And on the next page, I discovered that my mother, so many years ago, knew about Irena Sendler. She would say, Irena Sendler, a Catholic social worker in Warsaw, defied the orders of the Nazis and smuggled some 2,500 Jewish children from the ghetto and saved them from certain murder. My mother continued, "After the war, we had to find the children. We talked to strangers and followed leads and traveled to small towns and villages and did indeed find hundreds of Jewish children, a very tiny number compared to the nearly 1.5 million Jewish children that were murdered during the Holocaust. But I was yet to discover how these two women, Irena Sendler and my mother, were connected. On two separate trips, I returned with my parents to Europe to learn firsthand what they had experienced and witnessed. We visited several cities and concentration camps tied to their past. Our trip began in the capital city of Warsaw. This is a photograph of my mother taken before the war in her Polish hometown of Tomaszów Lubelski. In the summer of 1939, she was invited to visit a favorite aunt in the capital of Poland, Warsaw. Before the war, Warsaw was a beautiful, vibrant, and bustling city with nearly 1.3 million people. Approximately 30% of them were Jewish. Here is a photo of the Old Town Market Square taken before the war. My mother really enjoyed the city life as a change of pace from her small Polish town. But life was becoming increasingly difficult for the Jews there. And now she shares their memories of that time.
I went with them, they came by car, and I went to Warsaw. When we were in Warsaw, I stayed with them, and they already started, boycotting Jewish stores. There were, Gentiles, anti-Semites standing in front of Jewish stores, screaming, "Don't buy from a Jew," and breaking a couple of windows. The Germans were not yet there, but they were already, as much as I could judge, because, I was a young girl and I was really not very much interested in politics. But I could feel it and I was a little bit scared,
There were some Poles, however, who bravely defied the growing anti-Semitism. This is Irena Sendler before the war, and the campus of the University of Warsaw on the right, where she was a student. On her student identity card, Sendler was listed as an Aryan, while other identity cards were marked with the word Jew. Sendler struck out the word Aryan from her card as she resisted the growing anti-Semitism. There was a policy that Jewish students were segregated in the classroom and forced to sit on separate benches called ghetto benches, which is marked by the stamp on the top left of this University of Warsaw medical student's identity card. Irena Sendler protested by defiantly sitting with the Jewish students in her class. For this, she was suspended for over 3 years until she was allowed to return and graduate in the spring of 1939. Both my mother and Irena Sendler were living in Warsaw when on September 1st, 1939, the Nazi army began the invasion of Poland and the bombing of the city. Here is what my mother remembers about that time.
In the beginning of September, the important incident, the beginning of September, my aunt, said it's going to be war, it's going to be war. Before we saw it, there were planes throwing bombs and us chasing down to the basements and spending nights in the basement and the morning out. And for almost a month, every single day were bombardments of Warsaw. We were most of the time in the basements with the people. And during the day, we went out to look for some food. There were people laying on the streets, dead, and it was war. The bombs, the buildings were falling down, the windows were all broken out, and before we saw it, it became quiet. And then my aunt said, if we don't go out, we have to see what's going to happen next. And the next, we heard marching Germans.
On our visit to Poland, we saw the rebuilt Old Town Market Square, shown here next to a photograph of how it looked after the bombing. A year into the Nazi occupation, the Nazis established the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, where my mother was. Jews were forced to leave their homes and relocate into the ghetto from surrounding cities and towns. Jews, as forced laborers, were ordered to build this 10-foot-high brick wall that would seal in the ghetto. During my trip to Poland, we went to one of the last sections of the ghetto wall that is still standing today on Złota Street, which was just a few blocks away from Irena Sendler work in the social welfare office. There were over 400,000 Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the first year that the ghetto existed, starvation and rampant illness led to the death of nearly 10% of the Jews in the ghetto. Irena Sendler, as a social worker, was given a special permit to enter the ghetto and inspect for typhus. The Nazis feared this disease was going to spread into the general population of Warsaw. But Sendler secretly began to smuggle in typhus vaccines to help the Jews in the ghetto, along with food and money and clothing. In the summer of 1942, the Germans announced what was called the Great Action, as seen in this poster here. This was a lie told to the Jews that those unfit to work would be deported and relocated to the east. The Germans set up a daily quota, and in that summer, 265,000 Jews were forcibly rounded up and marched to a collection point called the Umschlagplatz. I visited the memorial to the Umschlagplatz here on the right, which was empty and silent, and in no way had the history of what happened during the terrible summer and those terrible years. Pictured on the left is an actual photograph of Jews there waiting to be deported. The Jews were loaded onto boxcars, including this actual photographed here, and actually only traveled a mere 60 miles to the Treblinka extermination camp. At Treblinka, the Warsaw Jews were among 870,000 people who were immediately killed in the gas chambers. Meanwhile, the ghetto was filled with many homeless and orphan children who were especially vulnerable to deportation, as the Nazis had no use for them as slave labor. Irena Sendler would take on a new role to save as many of these Jewish children as possible. For a while, she entered as a social worker, but then there was a new order that social workers could not enter. So she and others donned nurses' uniforms so they can continue to go into the ghetto to do their important work. At the beginning, it was permissible to claim that a Jewish child was too ill to travel, and instead be taken to the Jewish Children's Hospital in the Ghetto, seen here in the photograph. But soon Sendler and the others realized that they would have to smuggle these children out of the ghetto to save them. They hid them in garbage, in piles of clothing, and even in sacks of potatoes. As the deportations went on, the parents became more desperate, and they would try everything to save their children. Here is a photograph of children trying to climb the ghetto wall. Sendler continued to help smuggle children out of the ghetto, even through the underground sewers. Irena Sendler needed and sought out the assistance of many other people to save the Jewish children. Sendler had the idea of hiding children in convents. She asked this man, Jan Dobodazinski, who was a senior official in her office, for help. He agreed, and using his connections with the Catholic community, and specifically the Father Bedouin Children's Home pictured here, Dobodazinski signed papers, and that was a secret signal that the child seeking help was really Jewish. These Jewish children would be housed at the home for a short time before being smuggled out and hidden in convents. Every Jewish child needed proper documents to be hidden. Here is an actual falsified birth certificate that was used to save a Jewish child. Some of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto organized efforts at resistance. Hiding in bunkers and buildings with smuggled and handmade weapons, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was a heroic last act of defiance. But Irena Sendler continued to move in and out of the ghetto, saving the children from burning buildings and helping them flee through the sewers. In Poland, I also visited this monument to the ghetto heroes. I learned about the Jewish fighters who faced impossible odds against the armed Nazis and the innocent victims who perished at Treblinka. Irena Sendler was approached by members of a Polish underground organization that was codenamed Zgoda. There had to be great secrecy of who was even in the organization to protect the members in case any of them were caught by the Nazis who were looking for these underground groups. Sendler took on the code name Jolanta and became the head of the Zgoda's Child Welfare Bureau. Here is a financial report with her secret name in Polish and a census listing 575 Jewish children that were in hiding. Sendler and many of the underground operatives would eventually be caught by the Gestapo, arrested, and taken to this place, the famous Pałach prison, where they were tortured and many executed. I visited this place where Irena Sendler refused to give up the names of any of the others who were helping Jews. Sendler kept all the records of the Jewish children in hiding. Here is an original document written by Sendler, listing the money used to help support the 500 children that she had in hiding. Throughout the war, Sendler would write the names of the Jewish children in places where they were hidden on little slips of tissue paper that time and time again she somehow kept from falling into the hands of the Germans. These lists were buried beneath a tree in glass jars, and after the war, with much of Warsaw destroyed, she searched for these lists. She reportedly recovered some of them, and from memory, she recreated as much as she could. She gave the list to this man here named Adolf Berman. He was a Jewish member of the underground Zgoda, and because Sendler believed that those hidden children should be returned to the Jewish people, she worked with Berman to return them to orphanages and to try and seek their parents after the war. This is a promise that she made to every Jewish child that she hid. On this list seen here is Sendler's own name with the name of the Jewish child that she personally hid with a false identity. Here my mother again shares how she spent the latter part of the war in hiding, herself a teenager.
It was in different places. There was at times that I came out and I worked for Paul as a maid, cleaning out chicken coops and peeling potatoes, and and then when the peasant found that it's a little too dangerous, he let me go. and I went to another place, and some people hid me. In the others, I had papers that showed that I wasn't Jewish. So I was able to work as a maid for different people. I told them my parents are dead. They were Poles, and since I spoke Polish, I knew how to pray Polish. So lots of them did not suspect that I was Jewish because I had blonde hair and I was, a young girl.
The war came to an end, and Jews still alive found themselves liberated, but their lives had been destroyed, and for most, their families had perished. But Jewish orphans were still alone and in need of help to be reunited with surviving family members and the Jewish people. At a gathering that commemorated the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Adolf Berman stands here with a leader of the uprising, whose name was Antik Zuckerman. Zuckerman helped found an organization called Bravery, which means escape, to organize the mass exodus of Jewish survivors through Europe to Israel. Here, my mother shares another memory.
At one point, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, who survived by the name of Antik Zuckerman, told me, we need you more in the Bravery, and I started working in the Bravery. After the first 6 months, I used to cross the borders from Szczecin into Berlin with trucks of people and of children. Well, at one point, I was called into Lodz. In Lodz were headquarters. Lodz in Warsaw had the headquarters of the Bravery. At one point, I was called into Lodz, and they said they wanted me to undertake something else. They wanted me and another young man go from town to town, find out where Jewish children are, and try to, by paying off the Poles, or by bribery, or by whatever means possible, takes these children and brings them into Lodz, Warsaw.
Here is a photo of my mother with the other operatives of the Bravery. Standing next to her with a mustache is Zvi Netzer, the commander of the Bravery in Poland. Great Britain, who had the mandate over Palestine, was restricting Jewish immigration and wanted to resettle the Jews into Germany and their countries of origin. Here's a map of the major routes from Poland into Germany. The Jews traveling with the Bravery were told to tell authorities that they were German Jews returning to their homes after the war, and were given new German names and told to memorize German addresses. And so the Bravery, along with my mother, with great danger and difficulty, had to take people on foot, on trucks and trains, through the woods and even over the Alps to leave the dangers of countries where anti-Semitism was still rampant. I remember my mother telling me how these people would walk through the mountains carrying nothing because they had no belongings. So this is another of my mother's false papers given to her by the Bravery, stating that she was of German nationality from Berlin with a German name and address. I finally understood what these pictures of my mother with the children meant. She risked her life to return these children to the Jewish people, as Sendler had promised to the parents of the children she had rescued. These rescued children, seen here as well, show and help me understand my mother's story. Here, the Jewish children learning to dance the traditional hora, an Israeli folk dance, was taken at the kibbutz where my mother was at in Chechen. Among them are the children that my mother likely brought out of hiding. When I stood in the Warsaw Cemetery in front of a monument to the over 1 million murdered Jewish children of the Holocaust, I realized that each face, each child, each name had a story, and we must forever mourn the loss of the innocent lives and indeed their whole families. Out of the 5,000 Jewish children, that is all that survived from Poland. It is estimated that Irena Sendler may have assisted in saving half of them. Irena Sendler lived to be 98 and was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. She is recognized as one of the righteous among the nations, the highest honor given to non-Jews by the Yad Vashem Memorial and Museum in Israel for helping to save and rescue Jews. My mother, pictured on the right, lived to be 100 years old, And although she didn't speak of her years in the Holocaust and her work with the Bricha often, I'm happy to finally know her story and to be able to share about both of these incredibly brave women and their work in saving Jewish children during the Holocaust.